Welcome back, bulging bicep people. As you know from the title, today's episode of Ice Ice Beta is all about training for ice climbing, mixed, and dry tooling. Today we're chatting with Kevin Lindlau, Aneta Loužecká, and Zac St. Jules about how they think about and structure their training for their respective specialties. Kevin is a leading roof climbing dry tooler and the first American to ascend D16. Aneta was last year's World Cup champion in speed, and Zac, well, he's just kind of a guy we picked up on the side of the road. Just kidding. Zac is a strong, all-around ice and mixed climber who manages to send hard while also working full-time and raising 4 kids. Pretty wild. In this episode, we talk about each climber's unique journey and some surprisingly common training mistakes, why defining your goals is so important and how to structure your training, the importance of skill and strength, and if access to dry tooling is hard to come by, some cost-effective training solutions that you can essentially make for yourself at the hardware store. Normally, I put this at the end, but if you're enjoying the podcast, please leave us a review on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you happen to listen. It helps other people and the algorithm know that this is a pretty good podcast. So hang tight for the episode. We'll get to that after a quick message from our sponsors.
We get it. For us, ice season never really ends. It just kind of blends between rock, plastic, and plywood until waterfalls freeze again. No matter how you climb in the off-season, Furnace Industries keeps you going till your next bout of screaming barfies. With their gym-safe dry ice evolutions, you can keep up your fitness indoors. And if you're looking to challenge yourself on your home wall, they have the largest variety of dry tooling holds in America. Check out their full lineup of ice and dry tooling gear at furnace-industries.com. Because for us, it's always ice season.
Hi, it's Katie McKinstry Stylos, and when it comes to winter climbing, having the right gloves can make or break your day on the ice. With Anew, you're in good hands, a small boutique brand founded by passionate climbers for climbers. The mission is simple, to create the best ice climbing and dry tooling gloves that are durable, dexterous, and waterproof. Personally, I can't imagine climbing any day on tools without my Anew gloves. Whether I'm on a steep pitch and highlight climbing in my Vincent lights, belaying in the Bingo Cave with my Vincent mitts, or climbing at my limit in the Dolomites of Italy. They're my reliable partner in the cold and on tools. Experience the difference with Anew. Check them out at anew.com.
Really excited to try a new format. So this is a round table. And just to help the listener get a little bit acquainted, do you mind giving a quick introduction about yourself and what your climbing specialty that you'll be talking about today is? And maybe we'll just start at the top with Aneta.
Okay, so my name is Aneta Loužecká. I am from Czech Republic, from Prague, and I'm an ice climber, sport ice climber. I compete on World Cups in both disciplines, lead and speed. But last season I became overall World Cup and also World Champion winner in speed. And besides of being an athlete, I work as a full-time zookeeper. I work with a bunch of animals. I work with pangolins, Tasmanian devils, wombats, and polar bears because, if you are an ice climber, you have to work with polar bears, obviously.
And you import glaciers for the polar bears, but also for your training.
Yeah, it works great.
Naturally.
Yeah.
How about you, Zac?
Yeah, my name's Zac St. Jules. I'm from Canada originally, but live in the United States the last 18 years. So I'm sort of more American than Canadian, but I think I'd define myself as a winter climber. A friend of mine, when I first started climbing, we would go out climbing and he would just say, oh yeah, you want to go out winter climbing? And I think that just describes best what I do. I just winter climb, but with a specific focus on kind of rare ice and new mixed lines, I guess. Live in Maine, have a wife and 3 kids, and I manage a large retail store.
Are you Quebecois?
No, but my last name, being St. Jules, my family are all Francophone, but all from Ontario, so not Quebec. Yeah.
I won't ask you the poutine question, the one that no one will answer. It's too contentious.
I'm happy to give it a try. I might have an interesting opinion on it because I've lived in the States too. There's like a But it has to be cheese curds. That's like it has to be curds.
Well, it's not poutine otherwise, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
And Kevin, how about yourself?
Hey, my name's Kevin Lindlau, and I am a competition ice climber on the USA ice climbing team. And I've been competing now. This will be my 9th year coming up into it. So it's been quite a while. And I've dabbled in speed, but I'm a sloth when it comes to speed ice climbing. And then I primarily do lead competitions now for the World Cup circuit. And I would say the last couple of years I've transitioned to more outdoor roof dry tooling. So I would qualify myself purely as a dry tooler these days, and one of the weird ones that just lives in dark caves at this point in time. So it's a lot of fun, and I think the contrast of doing competition climbing and the outdoor dry tooling has been a really fun mix. I get to travel around to ice festivals now and get to teach dry tooling all over the country, which is great, and kind of utilize some of those skills that I've learned from the competition side of the sport as well as the outdoor side of the sport, and kind of put it together in one and get people climbing on all sorts of stuff.
Do you think at some point in the future your nickname will be the Batman?
It could be.
Hang upside down in caves and
I could see it. I could see it.
So we'll do a little bit of context setting for the listener. And I feel like one of the challenges, especially talking with high-end athletes like yourself, is I'll use myself as like a common climber. We hear of training plans and progressions and things like that. We're only seeing sort of the tip of the iceberg. You know, it's something that's you're able to do capacity-wise after years and years and years of training. And so just for our understanding, can you give a little bit of background for like how long you've been training and how long you've been training specifically for the discipline we'll be talking about today?
I started with climbing when I was 14, which is 10 years ago. At first, I started with sport climbing. I've been doing sport climbing in juniors national team for like 2 or 3 years. I think I got a lot of knowledge from back then. And then when I was 18, I really wanted to start with ice climbing because my ex-coach, Lucy Hrozová, she used to be an absolute beast in ice climbing and on UAA comps. So obviously I wanted to be just like her and really wanted to try ice climbing as well. So when I was 18, I started with Drytooling and ice climbing. I got tools in my hands for the first time. And then for first 2 seasons, I was basically last on every single comp because the difference between sport climbing and ice climbing in the matter of training is, I think, kind of huge. It took me several years to get into the process and to be able to do my own training plans and to know what's working best for me. In the beginning, I was training only lead, and in the last couple of years, I added speed as well.
Aneta, did you go when you started ice climbing? Did you think that your sport climbing was going to like translate really well to it? Like, were you bummed with your performance based on that?
Well, it's so funny because at least a lot of climbers in Czech Republic, they think that ice climbing or Drytooling or comp ice climbing, it doesn't really matter. It's actually super easy because, you know, you are hanging on tool. So it's basically a huge chuck. And, you know, I was 18, I was basically still a teenager, and I was thinking exactly the same thing. I was like, okay, so I have this great endurance on sport routes, so obviously ice climbing is going to be so easy for me. And then it wasn't like that at all, obviously. After like 3 moves in a roof, I was just fucked and I wasn't able to climb because I was so pumped. I think it did kind of translate, but the movements are just like so different, and the technique with tools is so much different from what you use in sports climbing. I think the endurance was helpful and this like strength in your whole body, but the other things you just have to learn, and it's completely different.
Yeah, my start was a little bit different. I was sort of this newcomer in New Hampshire, and is a very rich tradition of climbing in New Hampshire. And yeah, I found it hard to kind of like break into the scene a little bit. So a lot of my climbing was just like a ton of trial and error, and finally adopted the principle that strength is confidence, and built a home wall and just started training every day on it. And yeah, I asked that because I don't have some other thing to see how it translated. Like when I first started, there was nothing that I went into it thinking, this is built a great base for me, or or whatever.
I think it gives you kind of base, but the thing is, at least on competitions, it's not always about how strong you are or how big your endurance is. It's about the experience with tools and about how can you actually move and make decisions with tools. At least for me, it took me so long to learn this, and it's still in the process. So for me, probably the biggest milestone was when I went to Kirov, to Russia, for trainings for like 3.5 months at first. That was when I actually started to feel more like an ice climber than sports climber. Because before I was just sport climber trying to do something with tools on a wall, but it felt so much different to me.
I think like you said, Aneta, it was like I came from a similar background as you as far as like going from sport climbing to the ice climbing. And it's not just a strength-based sport. It's like half a skill-based sport. So understanding how the tools and everything function on the holds and being able to apply your strength to that, but have that technique, it's a tough transition, but it makes it really unique for that reason.
Yeah, I agree. And it's so cool to do like both of these disciplines, or like both sports, every single spring when I'm coming back to sport climbing. I almost feel like if I have never sport climbed before after the whole winter on tools. It's just different.
Kevin, you started with sport climbing, but you very quickly transitioned to training on tools, no?
So when I started, I think previous episode we talked a little bit, I was bike racing, and then it wasn't until I went to college that I started rock climbing. And when I was rock climbing, I got really into it, and I eventually took up competition sport climbing. And my first 3 years, I was really, really heavy into it. And at the same time, I had started ice climbing and dry tooling a little bit on the side. However, my last year competing, I ended up injuring 2 finger pulleys. And I had to take a break from rock climbing, and I couldn't train. And I was like, oh, well, it doesn't hurt to hang on my tools. And that was my transition. I was like, oh, okay, I'll just keep dry tooling through the summer. And then I never went back. And it was super fun. But I think I was expecting when I started to have my rock climbing training and fitness translate better than I thought it would into the dry tooling side of things. And I just got shut down at the start. Like routes, I could barely get off the ground. And it was primarily the technique. And as Aneta mentioned earlier, the body positioning is different than rock climbing. When you move your body around in your rock climbing, oftentimes as your body angles adjust and our hand position isn't as ideal as when we first grab the hold, we're able to grab or change our grip or squeeze harder on the hold, where dry tooling, we can't do that. As you move your hips out and things, that changes our pick angle, and that can cause you to pop. It doesn't matter how hard you squeeze the tool. So I think a lot of that technique and stuff, it was an odd transition for sure from the rock climbing.
That's a great point. When you bring new people out, like the first thing you notice is that some of it is just body movement, but a lot of it is where are they taking the holds, and how many times I've been like, oh, that's just going to blow off. Like, but no, not knowing that interaction with the pick and the rock. And that's the movement that takes a long time to learn, I think, in like dry tooling specifically.
Yeah, definitely. It's a learning curve for sure. So as long as people can stay strong and get through that part, makes it so much more enjoyable. And then you can apply that strength from whatever background you're coming from and really excel at it.
Just again for context, sorry, I'm going to be a little pedantic here. So Aneta had been climbing for 10 years. Zac, how long had you been climbing for?
0. I ice climbed before I did anything else.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I was 17. My wife brought me out. We were dating at the time, and she brought me out ice climbing with her father. And
cool.
We just top roped, and yeah.
That's a cool way to get into the sport.
And Kevin, you started in college.
Yeah, I'm around 13 years in now.
For me, it's like 10 years of sport climbing, and then it's going to be 6th season ice climbing.
So many questions that I want to ask and deviate to, but I'm going to stick to the script. So we have the context for, what your specialty is and how long you've been doing this. But let's kind of dive more into the disciplines themselves. A big part of today's conversation is going to be around, how can someone who's listening to this, how can they think about their own progression plan or their own goals and objectives? And how can they think about, breaking down that discipline, that sport, that project into like first principles? And how can they start thinking from those first principles, like what do I need to do to structure my training and what sort of exercises do I need to do? And I'm using that as sort of like the background context for this question, which is, within your discipline. So Aneta for speed, Zac for, big days, mixed climbing. Kevin, we're going to focus on cave being the Batman.
Works for me.
Sorry if you don't like this nickname. So cave climbing, with those specialties, what are the first principles or the ground rules for like this sport? Aneta, do you mind just describing like what speed climbing is?
Yeah, well, speed ice climbing is so much different, or at least trainings for it are so much different from lead ice climbing. You use different tools. During competitions, ice climbing competitions, we normally for lead use these specific comp ice tools, but for speed, we use something called fifis. It's like very small ice tools, which are very, very sharp and super light. The goal is to be as fast as possible on walls, which are usually between 12 to 16, 17 meters, and it's pure ice. I would say this is also the biggest training problem for this discipline, because you actually have to or should get ice for trainings, because during comps you are climbing on pure ice. It's not a wooden wall or something like that. It's always ice.
You see a lot of the plywood builds. Do you feel like those replicate well what the movement is like?
Well, I actually have one at home. It was built last year during the summer on our house, because without that I didn't have anything for training, like anything. It helps, I would say. At least it helped me mentally to be like, sure, I got the technique, I got the right technique and the movement. But switching from plywood to real ice is just a big problem. For instance, last season I didn't get a chance to try ice before the ice season, like before the comp season. So I was really training only on the plywood. Then in Korea, that was the first World Cup, I was just so nervous because before I didn't get a chance to train on ice or even try ice. And it really is different. Like the movement is a little bit different. You have to use your fifis and your crampons differently. It will definitely help to have real ice for trainings, but plywood is still better than nothing.
It seems like it's really good for just getting the muscle memory down, so that way when you're there, you can like execute that movement, huh?
Yeah, but the problem is the fifis and crampons, they act completely differently on plywood and then on ice. So I was, before the first comp, I was actually very concerned if it's going to help me or if it's going to make my climb actually worse, because you get this muscle memory and you always do the same steps with plywood. But with ice, you are not moving always the same, because the ice is different and you have to act differently on different parts of the wall. So I was actually really worried about this muscle memory.
Totally. Do you end up using your vertical like mono points, or do you end up using your speed crampons with the horizontal dual points when you track?
I'm using mono points, because with speed crampons it just wouldn't be possible to really climb on plywood. And also you don't use real fifis. The fifis I use for wood are not sharp at all, so it makes another difference.
I'm not going to lie, plywood racing is one of my favorite things to do. I think it's so fun.
Is it?
Yeah, I like it.
I like the ice way more. Like, I feel way more confident on ice than on the plywood. No matter how much I'm training on plywood, I still feel so much more confident on the ice than on plywood.
I feel like in the US, because we never have ice when we have to do our national championships or our qualifying events, so we always end up doing it on plywood. And it's like, it's kind of fun. I'd say it's the equivalent of going real Nordic skiing versus roller skiing. And sometimes the roller skis are just more fun. It's not like mushy conditions. It's just always the same and good. You just run up the wall.
Yeah, that's true. Like, I would say it's more fair because for everyone, the plywood is just always the same. While ice, it changes after every single run. So with a lot of athletes on it, it's always different between the runs.
Yeah, is there a sweet spot that you want to be in the when you're competing, like sort of middle ground when it's like a little bit softer? And
I like the most when I'm in the middle because if you are starting, there are no holes in the ice, like nothing. It's just like a glass or something like that. And then if you are last or close to the end of the starting list, there is so many holes. I don't actually like it because my fist just gets stuck in it. So I think being in the middle of starting list works the best for me.
So Kevin, you want to talk about like some of your more recent cave projects and sort of what goes into that?
Most recently, I've been focusing on large roof climbs in the Dolomites. And a lot of these routes are composed of large 30 to 40 meter roof sections, some even larger than that, and some shorter. With these routes, you have to be able to utilize multiple different skills. And I think as we had talked about in an earlier episode, there's different styles that we use. The routes that I was focusing on most recently, it was acceptable to use Yaneros or figure 4s and 9s to do these routes. So you had to train long endurance to be able to hang in figure 4s and 9s for these periods of time while also having to do dynamic movement. And this made the training quite difficult because usually if you're hanging in a figure 4 or 9, the movement tends to be a little bit smaller and you're more or less just trying to hold your body weight up. That's easy because you can focus on training your aerobic energy system in your forearms. So that way you're not producing bad byproducts, basically, and getting what we would refer to as the pump. And this is very easily trainable. However, with the harder routes, you had these dynamic movements, and this would make it so we would switch to, I guess the easiest term would be power endurance. So you have to be able to do these difficult movements that are going to produce lactic acid or a pump in your forearms, and then get your body to switch back to using the aerobic energy system. This training was pretty difficult, and it's not something that happens overnight. It was something that I've been building up my training for years now. And it's really cool because that style of training, your body actually adapts and will hold on to those gains that you get over years. So you can continually see progress as the years go on. This wasn't something that I was able just to do overnight. And I talked with many other competitors and Drytoolers to get a better understanding of the training. But I think just as a rule of thumb, always starting out like a training season, I'm curious to hear your guys' thoughts, but just with some sort of base fitness so your body can handle the workload that's coming up. So a lot of us here in the United States end up doing more of a base period that's a month to a month and a half where we're just doing a lot of mileage on ice tools, but not necessarily difficult climbing. And I won't be hanging in the roof upside down at this point. I'm just trying to get my forearms ready for the load, my back, my core, legs, really everything just kind of primed for a longer training season. So yeah, what I do is a very unique and niche kind of side of the sport where I have to hang my body weight upside down for a long time. And we can go more in depth on that training as well, but it doesn't happen overnight, and making sure that your body's prepped for it and getting that base dialed, I think is really key.
Yeah, I'm all about sort of establishing certainly early training season. Like spring is me just kind of, I do whatever I want, sort of decompress from the winter, pursue whatever seems interesting to me that maybe doesn't actually have that much to do with climbing. But come like summertime, usually it's around August, my like mind just sort of shifts naturally to start thinking about winter climbing again. I'll do a lot of stuff where like maybe I have to do max weighted pull-ups with a really high heart rate. So I'll go sprint 2 laps around the track and then go with a high heart rate, do a really hard lift. I don't know. I think I think that sort of coincides. It's like encouraging to me actually to hear you say what you did, because it sounds like, I know what you're doing is quite specialized, but it sounds like the approach is similar anyway. To be able to shift kind of back and forth, between aerobic and anaerobic as needed.
I think what you're saying, Zach, it makes a lot of sense, because I think you're mentioning doing more like strength training, and the foundation of any endurance is being stronger, because the more strength or muscle that you have, it requires a less amount of maximal effort or less percent of muscle to do the same movement that you would be doing. So I actually implement a lot of strength training specifically for my grip strength training, and that is going to directly affect your endurance and help increase your endurance. So a large part, like you were saying, of my endurance training is actually strength training. I'll do overall general body exercises to strengthen like core and back in the early season, but then I'll heavily focus on hangboarding and tool hangs to start to prime myself and get ready for my endurance training.
Are there certain tests that you guys are doing kind of early training season to see where you're at going into that next cycle?
For me, for the endurance stuff that I'm doing, whether this would be if I was going outside and doing just outdoor vertical dry tooling routes or focusing on roof routes or anything, doing a preseason test is really beneficial, because it gives you a good idea where you need to start your training, what you need to specifically focus on with your training, and what your future goals are for that season. And this isn't necessarily what everyone, I think, should do, and you have to cater your test to what you're specifically training for. But at the beginning of my training season, I'll set a route in our roof at our local climbing gym called the Mountain Project. Usually I'll have it up from the season prior, and I do a good warm up, and then I'll do one long burn. I see where I get to. I'll take a rest, and then I'll do another attempt. And I can directly compare how far into the route I got by the hold number or my time on how long I was hanging on the tools. And that gives me a good baseline of where I'm starting at. And then I'll also do 2 other workouts where on a hangboard, I'll jump on and I'll just do, like I said, a nice warm up, but I'll judge roughly compared to my times and weights I was using. And I'll ramp up to see what my max level is on the hangboard, so I can see where my finger strength is, as well as doing tool hangs. And ours are a little funky. I do like single arm tool hangs with added weight, and I kind of see where I sit as my max grip strength, and I build from there. But that's kind of my base season test, and that gives me a good idea of where I'm starting at, how I need to adjust my training, and the time frame I'm looking at to get back to where I was, and then increase from there.
For me, I have a lot of these tests in the beginning of the season or like training season for lead, like, trying some specific moves on my wall, because I have this small dry tooling wall on my attic in our house. Or I don't know with how big a weight I can do pull-ups and all this stuff. It's way harder to do these tests with speed, because the wall I'm training on, I got it last year, so it was my first season with it. And also it helps, but it's small. It only has like a few meters. So I'm able to finish this wall every single time within like, I don't know, maybe 4 seconds. So usually I don't measurize the time, because it will be basically always the same. What I can do though is measuring how many mistakes I did during the run. And obviously by the end of the preparations and just before the World Cups or the comp season, I should be able to climb this route without any mistakes. Basically any attempt I tried, and it should be without stabbing myself or falling, even though I'm tired and it's like attempt number 100 or something like that. In overall, it's very hard to do these tests for speed. I do have a lot of stuff for training for like dynamic and power, getting this into my legs. So for instance, I'm jumping, so I can measurize how high I can actually jump. But except of that, it's basically impossible to do any tests.
Will you ever do any like track workouts or distance, like 100-meter dash, to see like for running and your speed compared to like the prior year?
For me, the thing which is helping the most is not like normal running, but running up to very, very steep hill, which you would usually have to run on all four, something like that. It's very steep. Or running with a huge tire, and that I can actually measure ice, and I'm just adding the weight on me, or like making the hill more and more steep if it feels too easy.
I'm tired just thinking about that. It sounds hard.
For all four limbs, sprinting up hills sounds like a lot.
Well, and also it looks so funny because usually I do these runs as the last part of my training. And as I'm working, I'm always training late at night. So just imagine me in the middle of summer, these warm summer nights, and I have this headlamp. And very close to our house, there is this park with very steep hill. And there is a lot of bushes and everything. And I cannot even remember or count how many people got scared when just standing by these bushes or trees, and then suddenly Aneta runs up to this hill with headlamp on her, and yeah, it's so funny and it looks so weird, especially if I'm really running on all my four.
With your ice axes. I wonder if you've taken any notes from watching the animals that you care for sprint around, because wolverines sort of have an aggressive sort of like scrunching and contraction, right?
I think what helps a lot when I'm feeding kangaroos, I actually have to run and they're just running behind me, following me. I think that's actually the first phase of my training every single morning, being faster than the kangaroos. And then it's great to watch their technique during jumps. I think it actually helps quite a lot.
So similar to Kevin's question about, sprinting and sort of power-based like jumps, do you do something similar with like pull downs or sort of like tricep like extensions? Because you could probably measure like the power output from this.
Well, I do this type of training for lead because I'm not that small. I'm 162 centimeters, which is not the smallest. But my problem is my arm span, my ape index is -16, which is a bit crazy. And even the moves, which are like super easy for the other girls and women, I have to do it dynamically. So I do a lot of this stuff for lead comps. So I think I can just pretty easily transfer it for speed, but I'm not doing anything for the upper part of body specifically for just speed.
All right, Zach, we didn't actually talk about sort of what goes into some of your bigger days with mixed climbing.
I think with like kind of long days where you're sort of hunting rare ice, obviously there's the huge physical component to it, and I think that's like a little bit easier to measure. I think what's a lot harder to measure is the kind of mental part of it. Say that route you have been looking at for years is actually in. Maybe you're physically strong enough to do it, but are you mentally with it enough to, launch into this unknown? The physical stuff, there's tons of things. I mean, just tons of things I'm doing all the time, kind of year round, and then it gets more specialized. But the mental stuff, I really would just do things that make me uncomfortable a lot. And it's not even specifically climbing. Aaron, I mentioned you before, like I'll go run a 10K barefoot or put my hands in the snow for as long as I can, just because it's uncomfortable, not because it benefits physical strength in some way. The part of it that I think is mental, but it's also physical, is can you just kind of like be hungry for a long time? So like, I just won't eat just because it sucks to not eat, There's stuff like that. And I'll come up with random little things like that all the time just to kind of like test where I'm at mentally too.
I think this is so interesting because the mental part is probably the hardest part of competing for me, but it's so much different from the mental thing you are talking about. Because for me, it's just about stress and about being scared of failure, about being scared of falling low in lead or being slow or making a mistake in speed. And it's a huge problem and complication for me because I'm really, really stressing out during comps. And for lead comps, I think it's actually the biggest problem for me. Somehow I managed not to be that stressed during speed comps. I think thing which is helping me is the fact that the movement is always the same. So even though that actually and in fact the chances of making mistake are way bigger than on lead because it's ice and you're trying to be very fast. In lead, I'm still not able to quite handle the stress. So it's interesting to see that this mental part is also important for you, even though it's different mental problem with the climbing. For you, Kevin, do you have some special mental preparations, and are they different for climbing in caves and for competing? Because it's a different kind of stress, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And that's funny. You guys both brought it up because I train mentally very differently for my outdoor projects than I do for the competition style projects, like you mentioned, for our lead competitions in the World Cups. I'm not so concerned about my safety as much and worrying about that headspace, maybe like you would be, Zach, going out on your more adventurous alpine climbs that tend to have more exterior danger. But it's more the fear of failure and trying to like stay calm. And then also like in a competition, you get one shot, you can't mess up. So you have to be on it the whole time. And so when I'm doing my competition training, one of the kids that I actually mentee, it's fun. We'll practice once a week. We'll end up each grabbing some tape and we'll set ourselves routes. And we can't look at each other's routes. We'll give each other each 1 minute, similar to a competition route, to look at each other's route. Then we'll time each other and you have a one chance on site of it. So we try to, as you mentioned, Zach, put ourselves in that situation to kind of get us ready for it so it feels more natural. And I think that's helped me for my competition style climbing, not feel as nervous. Obviously, you're worried about failure. You want to climb the route. The other thing is whenever I start to time myself for competition training, it instantly puts a stress on you. And I find myself climbing sporadically, not as smoothly, and making silly mistakes, trying to shorten my time. So putting myself in this situation, often timing myself during competition training, I have found to be really beneficial because I find a calm almost. Then I'm so used to it that the time doesn't apply. And then competing like in a friendly competition with the kid I mentee, it makes it so, there's really is no stress. Like you're more focused on how you climb eventually, at least I found. So I find that interesting. Whereas for outdoor climbing, like you mentioned, Zach, sometimes you might physically be strong enough, but when you get to the route, you just might mentally not be feeling it that day. And I've started playing around with meditating right before my climb. So I'll spend about 10 minutes before I'm about to start my attempt. And I go through the entire route, just sitting quietly in my head, every move and what it's going to feel like to do that. So even if it's like, I know it's a hard move, in my mind, I make it really hard to do it. But then I picture myself pulling through the movement and I picture myself getting to the top and clipping the anchor, getting to the top of the route. And I'll also think about other climbs that I've done that I've been successful on. And that has seemed to help instill more confidence and a positive attitude going into it. And I found that to be very helpful before any of my climbs. So just about now, anytime I go out and try a difficult route, I tend to go sit and I'll just self-meditate for about 10, 15 minutes. I'll come back and that puts me in a much better headspace and feeling confident. And if I can't get there, that just might not be the day. But that's been for me a more consistent way of getting in a positive headspace for me for doing these routes.
Are you doing the same thing, not necessarily meditation, but like imagining you doing the moves, even during comps, like in isolation or something like that? Because this is what I found pretty helpful, like thinking of actually doing the move without trying it, in fact. But if you imagine that you are able to do the move, I think it helps mentally or gives you more confidence.
Totally. Yeah. When we go out, as Aneta mentioned, when we go out and do our route previews prior, we can kind of see where the route goes and you start to come up with a game plan of where you're going to do these movements, how you're going to do these movements. And I think, that's so helpful because it kind of helps you set up certain grip positions and how you want to move through the route. And something I noticed from when I started competing is I would run through and I'd have this whole idea of how I would do the route in my head. I'd get there and I'd have to be able to change it on the fly. But the other thing was I would make the move in my head not very difficult, or I'd make it smaller. And all of a sudden when I got there and it was harder than I thought, I would almost like shut down and wouldn't know how to like go about it. So I try to like make those moves that I think are going to be hard, really hard in my head when I'm like going through my route preview, at least in my head. I'm not sure if you do a similar thing, Aneta, but I think it's really crucial going through the whole route and memorizing it so that way you set yourself up for success the best you can.
I actually screw myself up several times, but for the opposite reason, because I was just like standing under the wall. And then I said myself, oh, this move looks so far away. Like the holes were far, or like it looks so hard. And then it actually wasn't that hard, but in my mind, it was still stuck that it must be hard. So during cleat comps, I really struggle with time. I might be an ice climber, like speed ice climber, but during cleat comps, I'm so slow every single time, because for me, in my mind, every move is like so hard. And even though it's not true very often, I just spend a lot of time unnecessary on this spot, which I put into my mind before trying to solve the problem, which is actually not a problem. So I have the opposite reason why I can screw myself up with this planning before.
For sure. And I guess I'm curious, something I didn't think about that I do now that I think about it on competition routes as well as outdoor routes. I wonder if you guys do too. I found breathing and training my breathing to be extremely helpful. So if I start a climb out and I do a couple deep breaths in through my nose and out through my mouth, that kind of calms me and centers me. But then if I can maintain that breathing and do slow breathing, it helps make my movements a little slower. Than if I do get nervous or I get to a hard spot, and let's say I go for a move and I botch it and I have to like reset, I start to hum a lot and it like distracts me. I'm like, and like that just like chills me out for some reason. I don't know. Do you guys do anything similar that kind of like recenters your mind or like makes you chill out a little bit?
I'm talking. I'm like so talkable. Like it's very rare to see me quiet. And when I'm nervous during the comps, during the climb, I actually talk to myself. It doesn't matter if it's in English or in Czech. It's something like, oh, well, I'm probably going to fall in this move. Oh, I'm not. And I'm really talking. Very often there are like photographers, close to us when we are climbing. And before they got used to it, because some photographers know me now, they always just bursted to laugh because I was climbing and I was just like talking loudly to myself. It helped me with breathing, and then like it made me calmer.
I'm not joking. I do all of those things, but with one addition. So I'll definitely hum to myself. I'll talk to myself for sure, like talk me through the next sequence of like if I'm looking 20 feet down at my last piece of pro, I usually start talking to myself. This is the one thing that I'll do sometimes. If I can see my partner, I'll start talking shit to them. And it's just something that kind of like, okay, I'm out. I do this all the time. There's my belayer. Everything's fine. And I'll just start taking the piss out of them a little bit. But I think, the breathing thing for sure, try to control your breaths in those sort of scary moments. It seems we all share some of the same practices there.
Zac, because there are those external factors, risk factors that Kevin mentioned, there's a heightened vigilance that's required, right, to be able to identify conditions and potential risk factors overhead, and especially things that you can't see. So there's a lot of like information gathering ahead of time before you even go out to an area to see like what was the temperatures the previous 7 days, et cetera, and what was the freeze thaw like, et cetera. What stuck out to me from Stas's interview was, he would be very attuned to the environment. He could almost like tell like, oh, like I know that pillar's that's not gonna hold. There's something about like it was like an energy almost that he was said he felt. But to break it down, it was probably more of like really probably the way that he was like hearing things and temperature on his skin and et cetera. He's probably able to just collate a lot. So for you, from like a mental perspective, like what's your mental space when you're going up to a climb? And do you also go through like a mental checklist potentially, like reviewing, these are certain like fundamental things I need to be like looking for?
Yeah. I mean, in New England here, we're not typically worried about like avalanches that much. I mean, they happen, but not on a lot of the stuff that we're going out after. Definitely some of the things you said, like where's the sun? What's the temperature supposed to be today? Actually, one funny thing is like, if this lead is going to take me 2.5 hours, how hot is it going to be when I actually get up there? Or how cold is it going to be? It's funny that Stas said that because it's the part of ice climbing I actually like don't like the most, which is that there is so much intuition, and I'd love to spend more time actually breaking that down, because I think you're right. It is actually definable. You just have to be able to put words to it. But yeah, exactly what you said. Like, how moist is my skin right now? That would be really fun to kind of really try to break down. But for sure. And, a lot of it for me is visual. I think when you get to a certain point, like I always say, with my wife, like, the ice tells me how I'm going to climb it. I'm not going to deviate that much from what the route is, how it's formed, right? Like, you can't just break off left or right or whatever. And that's probably true in comp climbing, right? There's just a couple of ways you're going to get up this thing. So I think like being able to read the route is something we do in steep ice and mix too.
Yeah, it is pretty cool. I think it's a good thing to practice for anyone going out. Like, it's such a good skill to have. And if you kind of know what to expect, it's going to help you directly in your climb. Just because oftentimes I feel like when we get to situations on a route where you don't know what you need to be doing, we go into a panic state, and those panic signals make us over grip and stuff, and it'll hurt our performance. So, if you just go out, whether you're training at the gym and you're doing just a warm up route, kind of look and, scout out the whole thing quick so you have a game plan. And if you're going out and working on a project, the same thing. But any level practicing that, it becomes habit, and that inherently is going to make you able to hit a higher point of like your max performance.
I want to get to more of like the structured training, but I want to ask Aneta first. Mentally framing something to be quite difficult, has that been something that you've explored with regards to lead climbing? Has it been an aspect of your training that you maybe like have thought about focusing on or exploring further? I'm wondering how the dynamic is different with speed, because it seems like speed, like you kind of know the movements, you kind of just go for it. Maybe you don't have time to overthink it. So I'm wondering if you could just talk to those two.
Well, for me, the biggest problem with lead is no matter how hard you are training, it's also the part which I love the most about our sport. Every single time, the route is different, and the movements are different, and the holds are different, and you can spend hours and hours on wall and then just fall because you didn't read a hold or, I don't know, move well. And then for speed, it's a bit different. You know exactly how to move, and you know exactly how to use the technique. For me, using my plywood wall this season, or like last season already, helped me mostly not because of the, I don't know, like muscle memory or this stuff. It could actually make my speed climbing worse. But in fact, it helped me mentally because I got so many laps on speed wall that I knew that I'll be able to perform this technique quite well on ice speed wall on comps. With lead, for me, it's way more difficult to be mentally stable and not nervous and not freaking out about every single move. Because even though I kind of know that I am supposed to be able to do this move quite easily, I have never done this move. Obviously, nobody from the field did. But for me, it's so stressful not knowing what exactly am I supposed to do. With speed, the hard part mentally is that even the slightest little mistake can make you lose. For instance, in Sasfe, I was second because it was 0.01 seconds, and I was second. So it's the slightest little mistake, and it can make you lose. I think important thing for me before the speed comp is not to think about it and just be focused on the movements I'm going to do. So just before the start of my run, I always do the movements on the ground, and it helps me to move like more flawlessly on a wall because I'm kinda starting the movement before actually touching the wall. I cannot do that with lead because, the moves are different every single time. So you cannot really practice it on ground.
The words that are sticking out to me from what you're saying, it's like I'm seeing a move and I don't know how to approach it. and that's like slowing you down. And then it's like something around this unknown versus the known, like the known quantity of speed versus the unknown quantity of how to approach this particular thing. And then also having like the self-doubt messaging coming into yourself is interesting.
Isn't it interesting though, the common denominator here is like eliminating the unknowns, like in each of our sort of focused areas, we all want to just eliminate as much of the unknown as possible, so we can just kind of execute. So like Aneta is for, movement, like, Kevin even alluded to it in the very beginning, like just muscle memory type stuff, right? For comp climbing, it's knowing all the holds. Like that's actually a resource you have. You can kind of know all the holds and how to take them. That's, eliminating the unknown. The movement, you still have to execute, but you can know what you're going to. And then, for me, it's a lot of like, okay, have I been in a situation like this before? Have I had to get past a certain difficult section like this before? Okay, I know, how to kind of do this now,
I want to switch more towards structuring of training throughout the year. When you're evaluating your training plan for the year, where are you starting? We talked about testing and seeing where you're at today, but are you starting, working way backwards? Like, I have this project and I need to do X, Y, and Z to be able to achieve that. Or are you evaluating weaknesses that you'd like to improve upon?
For me in general, what I've found with other members in our climbing community that I've worked with in the past, defining for the next upcoming season what your most ideal goal would be. And this gives you a really good idea of what your end plan is and what you're trying to build up to. So for example, let's say if you were living in Bozeman, Montana, and your goal was to go climb the Nutcracker and you're doing a multi-pitch ice climb, I think that gives you an idea that, okay, I need to have stamina to be able to do multiple pitches of hard climbing. I need to be able to have the cardio, like Zac mentioned, to get to the climb. And you need to be able to know how to fuel yourself for getting up there, as well as have the resilience to be out in the cold all day. Versus if you were doing a competition climb, like I'm like, okay, World Cups are my goal for this coming season. Okay, I need to be able to climb really, really quick. I need more power endurance to do more difficult moves back to back to back. Things like that. You can start to structure kind of what you want your training to be. And that's kind of my starting point. I'm curious to hear what both of yours are.
Yeah, I agree with you. For me, it's important to know what with I was struggling the most the previous season. Right now is speed in lead. I know I need to climb quicker during the comps. So ahead, I know that I have to train for that and to make my trainings building up to moving quicker eventually on comps. I also think that in the past, we all were starting trainings and preparations for the season. Let's say, for me, it was about September, end of August. And in the past, I don't know, let's say 2 years, I think we all are starting a bit earlier. Like for me, it was June or July last year, and it's just the same this year. I think a lot of people is doing the same thing from UIA. How about you, Kevin?
Yeah, I start earlier. When I was doing specific competition training, I would start about 4 to 5 months out. But now that I have a focus of more outdoor climbing and I'm trying to combine that with my competition climbing, I start about 6 months out. And the way I'm gauging my timing for when I start my training kind of goes into, I guess, what would be my step 2, but figuring out what the original goal that we had talked about was. So in October, I'm coming back to Europe to climb in Italy and hopefully Slovenia and Switzerland. So with that, I'm like, okay, well, these routes are going to require me to train for more of that roof climbing. And I'll go back like, okay, well, I want to structure myself a linear training plan. And I want my training phases to be this long. And I work backwards from when I'm going on that trip. And that's how I determine, oh, okay, so for me to be in the shape that I want to achieve the climbing plan that I want, I have to start 6 months in advance to be able to fit that all in, deload weeks and all that kind of stuff in there, where the competition season, I kind of when I mix it, I only start about 2 months before now because I have such a large base coming in from my outdoor training. So when I used to do just competition training, I would start about midway through the summer, like you mentioned now, Aneta. And now that have a larger focus for the competition season, it's almost like I'm starting 8 months out if I count all that base. So it's a lot of training throughout the year.
That's interesting. I thought you were going to go the other way, saying, I mean, I guess that you technically did go the other way, Kevin, saying that you're kind of training like almost all year round, and like, but the specific specialized training, needs less time because your base is larger. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. And, competition climbing and outdoor climbing are so different. And honestly, between what the three of us all do is so different. As I mentioned, I primarily do roof climbing, which is such a different sport than going out and doing an alpine climb. I would have to train completely different. And I'm sure if I went out climbing with Zac, I would just get shut down on the stuff that you're doing. It's just such a different style of climbing. So you have to train very specifically to what you're doing, at least that I've found over the years now. And I'll cater my training based on, like I mentioned, those objectives. But I found ways to utilize different parts of those trainings from each type of climbing that I'm doing to benefit the other one. And that makes it more applicable for me to do these different styles of climbing in the same year, as opposed to have to be like, oh, well, I'm training roof climbing this year, so I can't do competition climbing. It's just not going to work. And I found ways to use that. Well, no, actually, this roof climbing will count for my base. So that way my body will have that ability to do the harder training that I need in the more power-based climbing I need for competition climbing. And I just do a shorter training cycle then before the comp season, where other seasons with my comp season coming first, I'll focus more heavily on my power training and my speed climbing on route and being able to read moves quickly. And then I'll transition then into the spring into doing more of a base or transitioning and getting my fast twitch muscles to function like slow twitch muscles so they can function aerobically. So you really have to manipulate that, but it is possible to do multiple, I suppose, different types of routes throughout the year, but by catering how you train.
When do you think your roof climbing turned into base building? Because I imagine you can't just start with that. I mean, for people, if they're just starting to do sort of long extended roof climbing, that's much more of like a strength and muscular endurance thing, right? But then you've gotten to a point where it's almost like aerobic for you.
Yeah. And correct me if I'm wrong. I'm curious to hear, you both have done a bit of roof climbing before as well. So I'd be curious to hear how you guys have trained. And I've made a lot of mistakes in the past, and a lot of this was experimental training. And originally I thought, oh, well, climbing longer, in figure 4s and 9s or in the roof or however it might be is going to make me stronger. So my goal when I first started was like, I'm just going to climb really long time all the time. I'd get super pumped. And actually I had huge decreases in my endurance. It was really interesting. I didn't understand why. I'm like, what? I'm climbing longer. Like, how am I all of a sudden getting worse and worse and worse? And it's a form of overtraining and your body can't really keep up with it. And that's where I went back to earlier in the conversation, talking about strength being directly proportional to your endurance increase. So when I started and I tried doing those longer routes, I realized that wasn't working. My climbing was taking a hit, and I started researching more. And as I mentioned with my coach, Marcus Garcia, we started working more on strength training and arc training. In that prior talk, we had talked about arc training, which is climbing on easier terrain for long periods of time, and it's forcing more blood flow into the forearms, which helps to teach those muscles how to function aerobically, but it also starts to build more blood vessels within the muscles themselves. They get more blood flow, which gets you more oxygen, and you can function in that aerobic capacity better. So arc training ended up being a great tool for me, not only to build a base, but also to increase my endurance on lower angle terrain. And then I would mix that with strength training. So doing tool hangs with added weight in interval formats, similar to how you would use a hangboard. And then I would also hangboard as well. These were focusing specifically when I would do tool hangs, working on what we would call regular grip, when you grab an ice tool, how you expect to. And then the hangboarding actually transitioned very well to a grip known as reverse grip or false grip. And it's because we're putting more of our body weight into our index finger and our middle finger, and it helped train both of those. So I found my biggest gains in my endurance to come from that strength training and the arc training. And eventually, as you chart your progress over the years, you're able to see that the walls that you're doing your arc training on can get steeper and steeper to the point that your body, the body weight to strength ratio, you're able to actually do your arc training in a roof. And then those strength gains have to keep being pushed on the hang boards and tool hangs. And at least for me, I found that to be the most successful, increasing strength and focusing on aerobic capacity of the specific muscle groups that you're working on.
It's so funny hearing you talking about this because I did the exactly same mistake or thing when I started with comp ice climbing. I really wanted to get this endurance on tools. So the thing I was just doing, because before I got this my own wall, there used to be a climbing gym in Prague, which let me have this roof, ice or drytooling route on it. So the thing which I was doing, it was the only training I had except of strength training, was climbing in the roof endlessly, just figure fours and nines. And I thought and I believed that it would make me stronger, and with great endurance. And just as you said, it didn't work like that at all. I actually felt worse and worse because I was just overtrained. And then I started with normal climbing. I mean, not in the roof, still on tools, but more like technical moves. And then trying to get more strength into my body and into my grip. And it worked well. And right now I feel so strong in figure fours and nines. It's my favorite style of climbing, but I'm basically not training it at all anymore. I am, but just not very often.
Totally. You wouldn't expect it at all, but funny enough, the science is there to, support it as well. So that's really cool to hear.
Why DTS exists. So eventually you just get to the point where, figure four and nine's just kind of nothing. And then, I don't know. Yeah, I guess, I definitely experienced the exact same thing. Started, doing strength. It's not even climbing specific strength training. And that's true too. If you look at climbing coaching programs, they have all kinds of movements that are not specific to climbing in there because you're trying to build power and strength that translates.
Yeah, totally. And I'm sure you guys do this as well. But in my base phase, I think I would in general structure a season if I was doing a linear training program. So going from early season to end of season being my timeline. The start of my season would start with a base phase. And in that base phase, I usually focus on that lower intensity climbing, but doing more of it, but also doing my general strength phase. So I'm doing more general strength training movements or weightlifting movements, but to build broader strength throughout the muscle groups, whether it be in my core, my legs, upper body, forearms. And then I transition to more sport specific strength as the season goes on. Ending eventually with my power training that's going to end up being very dynamic, which sets us up well for competition climbing. I'd be curious to hear if that's similar to what you both do.
Identical. Yeah. I mean, that's exactly what it would be for me. Yeah. So my base is the actual test, we were talking about tests earlier. For me, it's really important. I want to be able to run, a sub 6 minute mile, all the time, always. So that's a base for me. Another specific test is can I do 300 pull-ups in 30 minutes? The dead hang for 6 minutes on tools. These are kind of specific benchmarks for me. And that's no dropping hands. I put run a marathon down here, but that's probably not actually, that's just very specific to me. It's just I always want to be able to run a marathon off the couch. So, but then as it goes on, as we get closer, if I do have a specific project, I'm maybe actually mimicking movements, to your question, Aaron, I'm recreating actual moves that I'm maybe have to do on this project. I have these things called sand bells. They look like pancakes, but they're filled with sand. And I was talking to this baseball coach and I was asking him about grip strength specifically. And he said, you take these sand bells and you flip them in your hand over and over again until you just pump out of your mind. It's really, it's for me, the general strength versus specialized strength is easily separated for me by, I don't know. It's funny because I'll just, as we get closer to a specific time where I can go out and, work on a project, I'm just working forearms almost, it seems like. And maybe some recreating moves, but that, I feel tell me what you guys think, but I feel the strength in my forearms goes away faster than any other specific muscle group.
Yeah, it's interesting. I found if I take a break, I think it I do notice a drastic drop in my grip strength, but I found it to come back much quicker than other muscle groups. And I think that's just because of the length of time now. I've been training grip strength. It's been like 13 years at this point. So I feel like I do have a steep drop off of it, but I think it's more or less the neurological side of it where body forgets how to fire all of the muscle at once. And it seems like that comes back quicker, at least for me. But I do definitely notice like a pretty steep drop if I haven't been climbing for like 2 weeks and I jump on tools. I'm like, whoa, okay. But then it seems to be like, 2 weeks later, like, okay, we're back to baseline. That's good. And you have a mini heart attack for a second that your months of training are gone. But yeah, it seems to come back.
Yeah, for me, it's also like in the beginning of season, it's almost like if I didn't know how to do dynamic moves on tools. It's not like if I wasn't strong enough for them. It's more like I don't know how to do this move. For me, it's the first thing I always lose. And then it comes back so quickly, like you do one or two of them and you are just where you were the last season. So for me, this is one of the tests I'm doing. Like on my wall, I have the same move for like several years. I have been changing all the moves, all the holds, obviously, but this moves is same for like, maybe the 6 years. And I always try to do this move in the beginning of season and then close to the comps. And this is how I measure ice, if I'm ready for comps or not.
I think it's kind of neat compared to what you both said. Like I'm in a phase now. I'm actually all the routes I'm going to go try. I'm primarily trying to do DTS this round, just because that's what the caves were established as at this point. And like you mentioned, Zach, right now, I'm basically just training my grip strength. I'm not really climbing that much, but then I'm also doing, because of this DTS and having to bring my body up, I'm training my core really heavily right now. But then as it gets closer, I'll start to switch and I'll start doing some of that strength training for like my core and stuff, knowing that like I built the muscle. Then like Aneta said, I'll start doing what we refer to as repeater moves. And I do this especially before the comp season. Similar to rock climbing, I actually have a wall set up as a system board, and I'll pick a specific movement and I'll run it as a workout. So for example, I'll have a Stein pull. I'll do a Stein to a floater and I'll go straight up, side to side, and I'll do that for an interval time, and I switch and there's no rest and it's building. So when you're exhausted, your body knows exactly where like your legs need to be placed or whatever. And I'll switch to kind of that muscle memory side of it and applying that strength. And so it's kind of fun to hear the combo of how you both are utilizing that training.
I want to get more nuts and bolts too, because a lot of the questions that we did get were from more beginner minded climbers or experienced climbers. And so I think just having some of those like numbers to grasp onto is useful.
I'd love to get specific. That's the sort of the fun part, because we've all spent so much time actually building out our, what our training actually looks like. We, I'm sure we'd all love to kind of geek on that a little bit. Yeah, do you guys know that story of the sport climber that casted his legs for 6 weeks so he would lose mass in his legs so that he could sport climb harder? That's a true story.
That's committed.
Yeah. Right. So that's what I like kind of don't want to do. But I hold in my mind this kind of local legend here, Alden. He said to me one time, he's like, because I was like hoofing it to the cliff, which was like a ways away. Like, it's about a 3-mile hike. It's not crazy, but you still have to kind of be fresh once you get there. And I was really kind of moving because I was amped. And he said, don't tire yourself out before you even get there. Right. So like, that's like a base principle for me is, do I have enough in reserve? And it's not necessarily physically, but have you like tired yourself out physically and now it's affecting you mentally? So you're going to look at this thing and be, when you feel tired, you don't feel confident. And so knowing that you have a ton in reserve, I think is huge. But yeah, I mean, I run a lot. I do like hill repeats on a bike just for, kind of like, I really don't want to build that much mass. So I'm not like, it's very rare I'm going to do like a max deadlift or a max squat or something. But, a lot of like kind of high rep stuff to maintain and build endurance. For beginners, I know I keep coming back to this like test yourself thing, but like build where you're at. Like find out like what is it you're trying to accomplish. Like let's say you just want to get really comfortable on M6 or something, right? Like Go top rope an M6, see what it feels like, and then go test yourself. At that stage, like there's so much room for growth kind of really fast. So I think you can build tests for yourself and measure yourself and train those things. Like nobody's naturally good at pull-ups. So just do pull-ups a bunch. You know, like nobody the first time they ever got on a pull-up bar just like cranked out 30 pull-ups. Like do some things that are like well known to translate to climbing and do those movements a ton, you know, until you're good at them.
Yeah, I think off what you were saying too, Zach, like for a lot of people getting into the sport, whenever I have them go out and they want to like know how to train for the ice season and stuff, I mean, just getting out and climbing on routes, especially your first couple years, is going to be the biggest thing. We talked about earlier in the episode that so much of the sport, like in my mind, I relate it to being half a skill sport, and you just being strong isn't going to give you those skills. You're going to have exponential increases in your climbing, whether it be grades or strength, just from actually going and doing it. Doing those movements on route is physically working those muscles needed to do that movement. So you're going to get physically stronger, but you're also going to get mentally stronger because you've built confidence now in that movement that you're doing. And you have a better understanding of how to utilize your tools and your crampons on the rock or ice. And I feel like, yeah, the first year or two, just going out and the more mileage that you can put, whether it's in a gym, climbing on plastic, with tools, or whether it's going outside and climbing for real on ice or mixed terrain, is going to exponentially benefit your climbing, not only in strength gains, but in skill gains. And one final thing that I try to get some of the kids I'm working with, and as well as some of the other climbers, is play around with your nutrition. So like Zach mentioned, going out, especially in the US, a lot of our climbs are pretty hard to get to. And we don't want to be tired by the time we get there. So we need to know how to fuel our bodies properly. And that's going to make or break your day. If you end up getting beat, you didn't eat enough, and you had to walk a couple kilometers or miles into your climb and it's cold out, you're burning more calories than you think. Now you're exhausted for the climb. That's going to make you feel weak for doing it. So yeah, throughout your training season in the summer, play around with what you can eat, when you need to eat, what you need to eat, and how to fuel your body appropriately. I think that makes such a big difference in your performance. And we had talked about in another episode, I had to play around with this a lot. And you'll find things like eating a big burrito right before you climb isn't always a great idea because you kind of feel like, bleh. But like, you know, finding something that has like sugars that you can use and your body can use like right away, but then using slow burning carbs to give you long-term energy or fat, I found to be very beneficial and make it a more positive experience for people, especially climbing in the winter.
I just want to jump back in because I definitely don't want to make it sound like I think strength is the number one goal. I really agree with Kevin. It really is movement. In fact, sometimes you see people kind of doing too much weight training or like climbing specific training, but they haven't mastered the movement of climbing yet. It doesn't do them any good. They're still just like, you know, sort of flailing around up there. So I really I agree. I mean, I think that's the most important thing. I guess I'm just sort of advocating for knowing where you're at so that you know what to build from, and for the strength training stuff specifically.
Those tests, even if you're just doing the climbing for fun the first couple of years or two, are so fun and motivating because if you keep notes, which if you're training and you're committed to it, taking notes of your training is so fun because you actually get to see the progress and it's motivating. Even if you feel in a slump, you can always look back. So, you know, whether it's like you said, Zach, doing like those pull-ups at the beginning of the year, even before you've been out and climbing, you can see at the end of season, like, oh, cool, like I am doing 30 pull-ups or whatnot, where I could only do like 5 at the start. Like, it's just reassuring that you're on the right track.
I agree with both of you. I also think that in the beginning, a lot of people, and I was just the same, want to find a key or plan which will make you climb immediately better or great, like, you know, specific exercise and specific number of repeats and series and all this stuff. And then it took me very long to be able to say it doesn't work like that and everybody is different. So my advice would be just as you said, in the beginning you have to find where exactly and in which stage you are, and you have to understand your body. For instance, for speed, when I started in the beginning, I wasn't even trying to climb fast. it wasn't about how strong my legs were or powerful. It was only about the technique and if I was able to climb it flawlessly or not. So for the first, not even weeks, but months, I wasn't even supposed to be trying to climb fast. The only thing I was supposed to do on real ice in Kirov when I was training with Russians was to climb the ice speed wall without any mistakes. And then when I was able to do it regularly, I was allowed to add speed into it. And just then I was allowed to start with, training of my power in legs, like, these box jumps and runs with tires and runs up to the hill. But it was after I got the technique right, because that was the key. Then when you are strong enough to just push with your legs and to do all these moves very powerfully, it actually makes your technique worse. And then you get into a point in speed when you cannot do much with strength training anymore. Then it's only about technique and about climbing flawlessly again. And if you get wrong base in the beginning, it's much harder to get it right afterwards.
Yeah, Adam Ondra has a quote. He said anybody can climb V10 with great technique and no strength. I mean, felt insulting, but
one of my old favorites too is watching like Chris Sharma. He used to do like V10s and stuff and like, the OG 510 mocks and stuff. And I'm like, his technique's just so dialed. You don't need a pair of like solutions to go climb that. Like, probably give him flip flops and he'd be fine.
What's interesting, at least from my vantage point, is I've seen popularity be starting to grow in more urban-based areas, and there aren't easily accessible crags or dry tooling gyms or things like that. And I get quite a few questions of how do I get better technique or skill-wise without having that access?
That's sort of my situation, not because it's not accessible, but I've got 3 kids and a full-time job, and so my time out is limited. So all the work I have to put in is in the gym. So I'm up at 5 every morning. I'm at the gym for an hour and a half from 6 to 7:30, 5-6 days a week typically. And it's all the work I'm putting in is there. So I empathize with those folks where it's just a little bit less accessible. I wonder if throughout this conversation, that's why I've been kind of so focused on that type of training, where it's maybe you're not getting out as much and here's what this looks like to kind of be ready when you are. And again, that is though taking into account that I've got 11 years of climbing and, the technique is mostly learned. It in some ways like riding a bike, I think, if we're talking rock climbing, when to kind of drop knee, or what little divot of ice your front point's going to rest in the best, that kind of stuff like that. That was definitely happened over, the last 11 years. But yeah, no, those people that are asking those questions are, dear to my heart.
I was in the exactly same situation. When I started, I just didn't have place for climbing with tools. And let's be honest, if you cannot climb enough with the tools, then you won't be able to get the technique. In Czech Republic, we currently have great Drytooling comb wall in Brno, but it's without car, it's 3 hours from Prague. So I am training in Brno, but I cannot train there every single day. So what I did was building this small boulder Drytooling wall on my attic, and most of my trainings are being held there. I do most of the work on my home wall, or now home walls, because now I have speed wall as well. And that would probably be my advice. If you have this opportunity to have even the tiniest little wall or something like that for your trainings, it doesn't have to be your house. It can be your friend's house or something like that. Just do it, because it helps a lot. Mine started with just like one wooden log, and that was it. I wanted a piece of wood for Christmas when I was 18, and nobody knew why. And it was only because I wanted to do figure fours on it. And it started like that, and now it's, I'll say, quite a big wall. It's great for my trainings, but it started just as one log, and it helped me to increase power and everything.
Yeah, I mean, I think similar to what both of you mentioned, you can get a lot of training done in a very small space. And I think a lot of people assume that for us to be doing what we're doing, we're getting outside all the time, and that we have these huge, cutting edge gyms for doing this kind of stuff. And that just isn't the reality. Our sport in general is fairly small compared to rock climbing. Also, our holds that are available to us to do our training also isn't a huge market. So I'm sure compared to both of you, we've had to get really creative with what we use. So I think for someone that doesn't have the ability to go out and actually climb, having some sort of home wall, and it doesn't have to be big, as Aneta mentioned, one of my first walls was a 4x8 sheet of plywood. And I just plastered on holds on it, and I just played around with what my tools could do on them. And then if you have the ability to buy dry tooling specific holds, I think that's going to cater to people the best. And that's going to start to give you the idea of what your tools actually feel like when they're grabbing these holds, and give you a better understanding of the limits that your tools can pull outwards on those holds before going outside. And even still, that's very expensive. So to bring it down one notch further for the very, very new beginner, I would recommend going to the hardware store and finding all sorts of funky shaped things like eye bolts, door hinges, play around bolts and things, all make great dry tooling holds. You have to think very creatively of how to use these things. Door hinges can be taken apart, and if they're mounted onto a piece of plywood or a wall, it offers you a small 0.5 centimeter hole where you have to be very accurate, similar to dry tooling, to place a pick into. And also, if you turn a hinge sideways and mount it onto a piece of wood, you'll notice a flat ledge, and then you'll have holes drilled into it that could mimic a small dimple on rock. And we found that this makes a great way of learning how to scrape around on a hold and have to place your pick into that good spot. So just a quick, looking through your garage or, some old metal pieces or whatever you can find, just got to get really creative, can all be used as dry tooling holds. And I'm sure you guys have played around and found similar things, but it's a very cost-effective way for people to get into the sport if you don't have access to a gym. And it's going to give you a better idea of those limiters for the tools and what you can do with those picks on different shaped materials. Since rock is grown in all different shapes and formations, it really allows you to use your pick in a 360-degree range of motion.
That's so much true. Like in the beginning, all of my holds were just like homemade. Door hinges are classic. I love them. We used to make holds from wood as well, or you can even use stones. If you are a bit creative, you can find so many things from which you can actually make dry tooling holds. And let's be honest, even now I'm sometimes training on those holds because it's just great to feel different materials with your tools. And as we don't have certificated holds yet, we never know what might come the next season. So it's great to be a little creative with holds, not just buying them, but making them as well.
The other thing too with that, when I was getting started into the sport, I didn't have space to put a wall up. And we have these pieces of wood that would be, if you have any block of wood, it could be a chunk of a tree log, or it could be a 4x4 or anything. But we would take chunks of these about a foot long, we'd chop them and we'd drill holes into them, and you can attach cordelette through the top. And we would refer to those as a tuna log. But tuna logs are great because you could take it out to any city park or into the woods or a tree branch that you could find. And you can hang these on them, and you can essentially create your own climbing apparatus where you can do multiple moves across these logs, which makes great roof training. It makes, if you put your feet on the ground, you can angle them to whatever angle you'd like to train different difficulties. And they're easy to take down and store in your house, requiring very little space. And as you start to grow your collection, you can actually screw holds to these then. And it allows you just more space awareness, or space aware kind of like climbing ability. So you can store them easily in a house, take them outside. You can do it outside, hang them wherever. And it gives you the ability to go climb without a gym. I've had on my pick I'll use an old retired carabiner and I'll grab my tool and I'll be standing on a step and you hang weights off of them for strength training. So you can get that grip specific training without actually having to hang on anything. And I think a lot of people are familiar with like tension climbing and a lot of the climbing blocks that have come out for rock climbing where they place a sling underneath their foot and you can pull into it. We can do a lot of similar training with ice tools. I wouldn't recommend using a pick so you don't stab yourself, but you can take these picks off and then you can clip like a sling or into like a tin deck or whatnot. And you can actually gauge how hard you're pulling against something and do training that way. So even if you don't have the ability to climb, there's ways to strength train without that. You just have to start to get a little bit more creative, but it's very doable. And I think we can start to modify a lot of these things from rock climbing in the rock side of the world into our dry tooling and find it be very applicable for our training.
To see what Kevin, Aneta, and Zac are up to, you can follow them on Instagram. Kevin is at Lindlau Kevin. That is Lindlau Kevin. Aneta is at ANETKALOUZECKA. So not exactly the spelling of her name. So Aneta Loužecká. And Zac is at ZACST.JULES. Be sure to send them a thank you message if you found their advice useful. Speaking of useful, I want to thank Hannah Noel for providing the intro music and Andrew Solomon for editing. Really appreciate all that you guys have done for the podcast and continue to do. Thanks for listening. See everyone next week.